The collapse of FTX and the related contagion problem have increased the call for regulation of the crypto marketplace. The digitization of supply chains has been slowed by a patchwork of regulatory jurisdictions. The recent fines imposed on Meta in the EU for violating GDPR regulations have highlighted the need for normalized privacy laws. As the Web3 and Blockchain era take hold, we need to spend some time to think through how to strike the balance between protecting consumers and providing a stable framework for commerce, and overburdening an emerging technology and slowing innovation. Welcome to W3B Talks, an ongoing exploration of the impact of Web3 and blockchain technologies on business, government, and society. My name's Doug Heinzman. I'm the Chief Catalyst at the Blockchain Research Institute. In this episode, we're looking at regulation. And to help us navigate this broad and sometimes complex topic, I am absolutely delighted to welcome Alexander Di Giovanni to the podcast. Alexander is the founding lawyer of Pando Law. He helps businesses and blockchain projects navigate the law. Welcome to the podcast, Alexander.
Thanks for having me, Douglas. Happy to be here.
Yeah, this is such a fascinating topic. And, you know, that this tension between, you know, regulations are kind of important, right? Because, you know, without them, there's the risk of all kinds of abuses of various different freedoms and liberties. And as well as they're important to create stability, right? I mean, the SEC has all kinds of regulations around the trading and the commerce space, largely as a means to give everyone a collective confidence that there are rules and fairness, and thus reduce friction to interact with those systems and those marketplaces. So they provide a degree of stability that enhances overall productivity and overall efficiency of a system. So that's kind of on the one side of the equation. On the other side of the equation, we've got the issue that you can overregulate things to a point where you inhibit the emergence of a new technology, you inhibit innovation, you suppress the deployment of capital that might, support these kinds of innovations. And, I remember back, it was in 2019, Hester Peirce, who was the U.S. Securities and Exchange Commissioner, he commented that regulators tend to be skeptical of change because its consequences are difficult to foresee, and figuring out how it fits into existing regulatory frameworks is difficult. And I think that really kind of goes to one of the chief dilemmas we have is on top of all the things we just mentioned, we're looking at a technology space that is causing a very, rapid degree of change, and regulatory frameworks kind of definitionally are laggards. That it's difficult to change them. And so that's kind of the essential dilemma we're faced with. I mean, how do you deal with this stuff day in, day out? So how do you see this space?
I see the regulatory landscape as a really reactive one, especially when it comes to the Web3 world. And the biggest example that I've recently seen of this is actually, in response to the USDT and the FTX collapse and all of that. In early December, the Canadian securities regulators came out with a public statement where they said that in the future they're going to deem stablecoins as securities.
Really?
Yeah. So to me, that's a big example of a reactive statement that's coming from possibly the regulators not fully understanding, okay, what, USDC, no one really considers USDC a stablecoin. I mean, security.
That's right, because it functions as a currency.
Exactly. And I think this kind of reactive style of regulation is going to keep bringing on mistakes rather than, if we can sit down and realize, okay, this is what this tech is actually doing. This is what the, offshoots of this tech are producing. And, take a look at USDC, take a look at any other stable coin. And you can clearly see it. I mean, it doesn't really fit the bill as a security, and for them to kind of come out with a blanket statement saying, "Oh, okay, we're gonna start treating stablecoins as securities as well." I mean, it throws a wedge into the whole system essentially.
Yeah, that's a really fascinating, and I see that all over the place where, a lot of people that don't study the space in any detail, they kind of, throw the term cryptocurrency out there to describe an awful lot of things without truly appreciating that there are many different kinds of digital assets and they have very different characteristics. And while Bitcoin may be a digital bearer asset, Ether is a protocol token, and it's used as a means of facilitating, commerce within an ecosystem. And stablecoins are a functional digital currency. And CBDCs are yet another kind of animal. And then, of course, protocol tokens and governance tokens and natural resource tokens. There's all kinds of different digital assets out there, and only a relatively small number of them could be really categorized as a security. So I think you're on a really interesting point here. And so what's the solution there? How do we stop the regulators from kind of getting in the way of doing sensible things?
Well, specifically for the stablecoin issue, I think what they could do to kind of, pull it back a little bit is implement something like a proof of reserve. And where I can imagine this is kind of bringing accountants and auditors and giving them more involvement in the Web3 space, where they can go in and actually do a proof of reserve or an audit to show that, okay, this USDC actually can back all of its coins with US dollars. And I could see things like that being simpler solutions. But I think what needs to be done is essentially a large sit down between the regulators and people in the space, where, we don't come together as two different armies, but, we kind of sit down and collaborate and say, okay, this is what we're trying to do. We're not trying to step into the world of securities law. We're trying to carve our own kind of framework here. And I think if the regulators become open to that, instead of fitting us into the same box that was created, after the stock market crash in the late 1920s and early 30s, I think instead of pushing us back into that category, a new legal framework has to be developed. And I'm seeing a little bit of positive move towards that in Europe, where I think early next month, which I guess is in the next coming weeks, the EU is going to vote on the MiCA framework.
Okay, and you think that'll help? This kind of goes to, one of the broader pictures that or topics that we just alluded to, which is kind of the patchwork, right? So, that one jurisdiction is thinking about these things in terms of being securities and other ones aren't. That's going to lead to a lot of complexity as more and more of commerce becomes kind of global and multi-jurisdictional. So how do we deal with that problem? Yeah.
In my ideal world, there would be some kind of international treaty governing the relationships, or I guess the cross-jurisdictional nature of a lot of these projects, because at the end of the day, that's really where the biggest use cases can really run wild, right? And be free, because there's no issue with me sending Bitcoin across the world. If someone in Brazil, if I do a transaction with someone in Brazil, I can send them no problem. Or, let's say I tokenize an asset and an individual in maybe Switzerland wants to purchase a token of that asset. The Web3 is global in nature. So I think there has to be some kind of international understanding or treaty in place that provides a framework where, startups and individuals who are building in this space don't have to worry about, okay, we're good in Canada, but are we going to be good in the US? Are we going to be okay in Europe? Are we going to be okay in Japan? Because that's what I see. It's an obstacle that I see myself in my own law practice. Is I'll have startups come with really great ideas and we want to make it work. But and if it can work in Canada, that's great. Or sometimes I run into this situation where, okay, we can make this work if we set you up maybe in the Caribbean, but this you won't be able to release this product to Canadians. There needs to be some kind of international framework.
Yeah, so I totally get that. Those, of course, are incredibly difficult. I mean, in the crypto space, you've got some countries that basically have decided that they're, verboten and shut them all down and, declare them illegal. And you've got other jurisdictions that are making, significant, putting in place significant tax incentives to encourage, crypto companies to come up and set up shop and advertise themselves as having, little or no regulation around the space. So there really is this patchwork, and the goals and objectives of the various different policymakers and regulators seem to be very varied across, jurisdictions. So that's a real challenge. The case that I find very interesting is around privacy, right? Because we've been dealing with the privacy issue for quite a while, right? We've had, some proto-privacy regulations that started coming in place in the early 1990s, but really it was the GDPR regulations in the European Union that kind of became almost a de facto global standard. And it actually seems to me, and others have commented in, along a similar vein, that the U.S. And maybe even Canada to a certain extent, and a number of other countries, they almost seem to have outsourced regulation around privacy to the Europeans, right? They're saying, yeah, that's good stuff, makes good sense, and because commerce is global, you're going to have to, deal with that, and we'll just kind of, benefit from everyone, having to do that anyway. So instead of kind of getting into the policy debate locally and dealing with all of the political consequences of, kind of arguing about that, they just outsource it. Is first of all, do you agree with that? And second of all, is that a means of getting to some international norms? Just have one of the major players, figure it out, and it just becomes kind of the de facto.
So, although I don't agree with it, I think it's most likely to happen. And the reason why I don't agree with it is, I like to use Ethereum as an example. Like, Ethereum is originally a Canadian project, right? And they had to move to Switzerland because Canadian regulation wasn't favorable. And I tell a lot of people, the worst thing that could happen is we lose another Ethereum.
Yeah, no, I totally agree. And of course, there are lots of jurisdictions that are setting themselves up to be the next, Zug Switzerland, so that they, attract the likes of Ethereum when countries like Canada can't figure out what this new thing is and design an appropriate regulatory framework that allows it to, prosper. So that's totally fair. But let's just dig down the privacy space for a little bit, because, one of the really big issues or constructs in the Web3 and blockchain world is identity, right? And digital identity and credentials. And these are very fundamental to how we, first of all, express ourselves in ecosystems and define our worth to an ecosystem and promote our capabilities and our willingness to engage in commerce. And as we as individuals interact with various different systems, especially things like governmental services and healthcare. And, to date, identity has really been almost kind of a challenge mechanism that says, that they want to make sure, they know who we are so we can interact with their systems. But Web3 allows identity to be tokenized, right? It allows it to be, we all become effectively NFTs that have certain characteristics. And as we interact with the healthcare system or others, and, we'll have all kinds of new, both capabilities. And it suggests that we're going to have to do some rethinking about, the regulation, right? What does HIPAA mean, right? Or any of the healthcare record storage regulations? What do they mean in a world where we have the ability to interact in a peer-to-peer way with various different healthcare organizations? So how do we modernize some of those regulations to deal with the new digital identity constructs that come out of the Web3 world?
I think the biggest consideration that we're going to have to think about here is permissioned versus public blockchains. So for things that are like what I imagine is for very, I guess, personal or very privileged pieces of information like medical history, and things like that. Maybe even like, any legally privileged documents as well. For example, like solicitor-client privilege, things like that. I imagine that being more home on a permissioned ledger, for example, where you still get the access of or I guess the advantages of a distributed ledger system, but there is some kind of centralized mechanism that can guarantee the privacy for some of those more privileged pieces of information. Whereas general identity, I think, for sure sits well on a public ledger.
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between permissioned and public, right? So you could have a permissioned ledger on a public blockchain, right? There's all kinds of privacy layer 2 technologies that are emerging that, still use the Ethereum network as the network of, the settlement mechanism. And I think, in fact, that probably becomes a much more common mechanism, that you've got, public infrastructure that is supporting all this stuff, but you've got a number of, privacy and permissioning mechanisms that kind of get layered on top of it. So I think that's how we, differentiate those things. So that's kind of interesting. So I agree that, we're going to need to have mechanisms that allow people to establish the proof of who they are, and such that they can run around in a digital world and interact with other counterparties with great confidence. And, you're going to need some mechanism to do that, whether it's a government or a quasi-government onboarding mechanism that does that initial, proving. So that makes total sense to me. But even once you get beyond that piece of the equation, it seems to me that the regulations have been written in a way that assumes that data is maintained and controlled and architected in a certain kind of way. And, we're moving to a decentralized world where identity and what I mean by identity isn't just who I am, but my various different attributes, right? My healthcare records, my social network, interactions, my commerce, retail histories, that they become, my domain. It's not that some company or healthcare organization that is regulated to maintain, that state information. That state information is associated with me. So it's, we're going to, seems to me like we're going to have a bit of a challenge to, bridge these worlds, that those regulations are going to have to be kind of rethought.
Yeah, I think that's right. And in an ideal world, if everyone could securely hold all of their personal data themselves, that would be obviously, I think ideal. If for example, like your medical history could sit on your ledger, or if all of your trading history could sit on, if everything could sit on a ledger, essentially, all of the private information you need, even like, let's say a passport or a driver's license or any other form of ID. One interesting concept that I've seen in play, or I've seen in development actually, is almost like a credit system. So how it would work is essentially like a DAO issuing all of these digital identities. So, for example, like I would join, I would purchase and go through the process of digitizing my identity, and then any transactions that I go through and successfully, participate in, would grant me kind of like instead of almost like a staking reward, it would be like an additional token. And if an individual came across my profile and said, okay, this is Alex, this is his ID, and he has 3 million of these tokens, that means he must have done a ton of transactions truthfully. He held his his end of the bargain. I can trust transacting with his ID going forward.
So,
but then that begs the question of a social credit system.
Yeah, well, that's of course that would need its own set of kind of normalized rules so that those were quantifiable in a consistent way, which might in fact require some regulation to establish what those norms are. So that's it. Now, in that answer, you actually mentioned DAOs, which are a really interesting new construct, right? Distributed autonomous organizations and decentralized autonomous organizations. They are interesting because most of the regulation that we have, it involves definitions such as corporations and limited partnerships and sole proprietorships. And within each of those definitions, there are lots of, taxation regulations, or there are governance or reporting requirements, and there's a whole bunch of stuff, and it's written down and it's been evolved over many, many years. And suddenly we've got this new kind of entity that doesn't have a traditional hierarchical governance structure, that has potentially, fractionalized ownership, and that its operations are, automated through smart contract mechanisms. And I can well see it. And on top of that, we're going to have ecosystems of various different economic actors, that some of which may in fact be relatively autonomous entities like DAOs. So, how in the world do we adapt the regulatory framework that kind of defines what these commercial entities are and which ones and how they should work and what rules they're subject to when we have this new kind of construct?
Yeah, this is probably one of my most favorite topics. I think DAOs are going to be huge this year and in the years coming. And that's exactly it. It's a brand new form of social organization. And I see some jurisdictions kind of making good first steps to try and amend some of their corporate legislation to allow for the registry and legal recognition of DAOs. So, for example, we have Wyoming, which has done this, the Marshall Islands. I'm seeing, and I think an interesting case as well is the Catawba tribe in North Carolina, who is moving forward and using their sovereignty to be a Web3 friendly jurisdiction. And I think they're going to allow for the registry and recognition of DAOs as well. But going back to the question, I think the whole point of a DAO and like the progression of it from a corporation reflects evolution, like social evolution and the evolution of social organization. Because for these concepts, the corporation, the partnership, sole proprietorship, they've been kind of cemented in society for hundreds of years. Like you can go back to the church and look at it as like the original corporation. And I think what needs to happen to properly regulate these new entities is to sit down and recognize that it doesn't follow these other types of social organization. We can't really compare it to a corporation. It is its own type of entity. And although I think good first steps have been taken by some jurisdictions, what I've noticed is those jurisdictions which allow the registration of DAOs do so as kind of an amendment to their existing corporate law. And it kind of groups the DAO as its own kind of LLC or corporation.
And do you think that's sufficient, or at the very least a reasonable stopgap, or do you really think that it's just not a good fit and it needs to be fundamentally rethought?
I think it's a good first step in the sense of, okay, let's recognize that this is an actual entity. But I think what needs to happen is, an actual new framework or statute that comes into play that directly relates to DAOs, how they're made or how they're formed, how they're governed, because the governance process in a DAO is completely different from a corporation. And the whole purpose of a DAO and is it could be similar, but I think from a fundamental perspective, we're talking about participatory democracy versus representative democracy. So participatory seems is more like the DAO, whereas representative democracy is more like the standard corporation where the shareholders elect directors, those directors make the decisions. Whereas in the DAO, each token holder has its own rights to, put up a proposal, and everyone is participating in the governance rather than just the board of directors.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating, and it goes to a really kind of fundamentally fascinating question, and that has to do with as more and more elements of our society become automated, right? How do we assess liability, right? The case that a bunch of people are kind of thinking through is, what happens when an automated vehicle gets in an accident, right? Who has liability? Is it the driver and the insurance company that insures the driver, but the driver wasn't driving? Is it the car manufacturer? Is it the software provider? How do you assess liability for damage in a world where systems are complex, that they involve many, many components and a lot of automation? And so, in some ways, in a business context, some of these DAOs represent a similar sort of phenomena, right? It's not that they necessarily have a board of directors that you can hold accountable, or a management team that you can, throw in jail if they do something, or if they cause some sort of damage. That, how do you slot them into the legal system that has evolved based on very different kinds of principles about what an entity is and how responsibility works?
Yeah, that's a great question, and we've seen a little bit of a response from courts in the U.S. about this issue, but I don't think it's necessarily the best response. Currently, some courts have said that they'll view liability on a decentralized entity, for example, a DAO, and I'm kind of taking from the Uki DAO case in the U.S., where the Commodity and Futures Trading Commission went after them, and the judge kind of hinted that liability in a decentralized entity would be joint and several amongst all the members of the entity. And I don't think that's necessarily, again, I think it's a reactive claim versus let's see what these entities actually are. Let's see what the relationship is. Let's see what the hierarchy is, how decisions are made. I don't think it necessarily has fully taken that into account. And I think the analogy is great. Like, it's for a lot of DAOs, it's really just the smart contracts and the code that's running, and it's automated. And who can you really point to, right? Because in a truly decentralized project like Bitcoin, who are you going to sue? Who, especially if everyone is completely anonymous, like who can you really go after? Well,
exactly. I mean, and who do you call into court to testify, right? I mean, the 10,000 token holders, many of which are anonymized. I mean, how does that work?
Yeah, it's going to be really interesting to see how it plays out. I think part of what led to that kind of quote from, or not quote, I should say, but like part of that decision of the Uki DAO case was, I guess, kind of like a little bit of example making. Like, really, I don't think the courts are fully prepared to deal with that question just yet. So their approach was, all right, let me just scare everyone and say you're all liable. But how would they even enforce it? I don't know.
Wow, yeah, that's a real challenge. Switching gears for just a second, one of the areas that I've been spending a lot of time on lately is around the supply chain, global trade space, and there's just so much opportunity to improve things. The pandemic kind of demonstrated just how fragile so many of our supply chains are, just how important they are to the world economy. And there's lots of initiatives around trying to, digitize various different parts of supply chain, especially around documents. But of course, the jurisdictional patchwork is very complex and varied, and It's only now that some jurisdictions are figuring out how to give digital documents legal standing. And of course, that, beyond that, you've got all kinds of issues around the different, customs and standards issues. A lot of the debate around Brexit was around the various different rules and standards that the EU was imposing that, Great Britain didn't think was necessarily reasonable. All these things are introduce friction to trade. So how do you see, or have you spent any time kind of thinking through, or how would you advise a potential client as they kind of thought through designing a Web3 or blockchain system that was, tackling these very real world problems, but kind of confronting the reality that, the rules are so different, the vocabulary is so different from place to place. It's one thing to kind of say that the government should go and kind of figure it all out, and that's fine. But in the meantime, how do we think through how to do the best we can within the frameworks that we have?
I think, man, I haven't thought about it so much from the supply chain aspect, but I have thought about it from the side of secured lending. And here in Ontario, we have the Personal Property and Security Act, and you can register a loan. Under that act, they have a registry which contains, if I loan you $50K and we want to register it, we would register it under that act. And I think areas like that where there seems to be a more kind of seamless upgrade into distributed ledger technology, I think that would be the first step into starting to build out more distributed ledger systems in the government and allowing them to become more comfortable with it as well. Like the reason I say for secured lending is because the blockchain is, it's the best ledger, and it would fully satisfy its purpose of record keeping all of the loans, what the collateral is, what the maturity dates are. It would be simple to just be able to pull up that information, store it, and consistently update it. And the biggest thing is, in a lot of these claims, like timing is very important, right? So, it could be that I registered a claim under this act, and the next day, another individual registered another debt against the person that I loaned money to. And then there's going to be a competition. Who should get priority? Well, it was me because I registered it earlier. And if that kind of system was on the blockchain, then it would be incredibly easy to figure out, okay, well, this person registered their that security interest 20 minutes before this other person. So
or a patent or a copyright or any number of things.
Exactly. I think it would really facilitate a lot of or not facilitate, but really make it clear, that there isn't really a dispute, or solve these disputes. And from there, one system, okay, it works here. Now maybe let's adopt it to land titles. And then, okay, great, it's working on land titles. Now let's maybe adopt it to an even bigger system.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I think you're probably right. It seems to me pretty obvious that one of the lowest hanging fruit out there is to, reform some of the auditing regulations and, some of the record keeping and registry stuff, because, this is an obvious mechanism that has certain attributes that frankly obviate some of the existing regulation, or the need for some of the existing regulations. So that seems a pretty obvious and easy place to start. So my final question here is, you run a law practice that specializes in helping companies navigate this very complex, irregular, evolving, legal landscape. What are the common questions that you get asked, and what's the most important question that companies forget to ask?
So the number one, I would actually say this is just a straight up starting point. Anytime I'm approached by Web3 project is, are you a security or are you not a security? and that's unfortunately the one thing that we have to go through, and usually produce some kind of legal opinion or memorandum that they can rely on in the future in case anything goes wrong. The question that I think um, a lot of founders and builders in the space should consider is the offshore question, and really, I hate to say it because I wish Canadian regulation was friendlier, but unfortunately, a lot of the times, I'm asking projects to, hey, are you comfortable with, potentially having a headquarters in Panama or Cayman, or, depending on your operations, you might be better off making your HQ in Luxembourg or Switzerland.
And this isn't just for tax avoidance reasons, or sorry, tax optimization reasons. This is for
No, this is for operations.
for operations.
Yeah. Like, for example, if a tokenization company comes to me, I'll ask them, well, have you thought about setting up shop in Luxembourg instead? Because they've recently amended their legislation so that tokenized securities can be offered on their public stock exchange. It might be an easier time for you to operate and register there instead, versus Canada, where the OSC has pretty much put a prohibition on liquidity for tokenization startups.
Huh. Wow. Okay. Well, I think that's actually very good and sage advice. Well, any other before we close? Are there any other kind of pearls of wisdom that you think we should, talk about?
I don't know if I have. I don't think I have enough gray hairs to be giving out pearls of wisdom. But I would say the best thing, even in terms of legal for people building in the space and for people interested in the space, things are always moving. Obviously, things move much faster with tech, but the wheel still turns when it comes to regulation as well. I think if I could leave off with just like one message, if someone could just take anything from this, I think what we need is the most in 2023 is a push for education in the space. I think the more people that can be educated, the more regulators that can be educated, the more people that can participate, and the more regulators that can actually participate in the space and see what's really going on, and that not everyone who's building is trying to build a security or an investment product. There's a lot of people that are building that generally just want to make the world a better place or a more efficient place. So I think if 2023 could be the year of education in the blockchain industry for individuals that are not in the industry or that are interested, I think that should be the focus. And it's a long-term thing. It's a long-term investment.
Yeah, so I think that is a great piece of advice that, if we really want to see our economies and our societies take advantage of this remarkable new technology and explore it for all of the potential that it holds, that we need to engage, right? We need to have these discussions. We need to talk to people. We need to explain what this is to people, over dinner. We need to engage with policymakers and business people to, help them understand. I think that's a great call to action. Oh, that's, of course, very much what we at the Blockchain Research Institute have, trying to do. And I think, and you pointed out that this is a long-term project. In the short term, I suspect that your advice for any company getting into this space would be to consult a lawyer that has specialized knowledge about how these systems work. That would be the short-term advice.
100%, and be careful out there, because there are a lot of professionals who I think are capitalizing on the popularity of the space. But I think, have a discussion with the people you consult, get a little bit of background, do some due diligence, and see, their involvement in the space and their experience in the space as well. And I think that makes a big difference, because I've had clients of mine come from other law firms or from other lawyers or other professionals who, they were not completely happy with, or they thought, okay, this individual wants to do it this way, and they might already know that, okay, well, this way is a little bit outdated, or they're not completely keeping up with the tech, or they don't see them at the community events, things like that. Like, I think Web3 has a really kind of like strong community base and foundation, in the sense of not just a community, a decentralized community. So if you're looking for professionals, ask the community about them, because if they're involved and they're reputable, community will know about them.
Well, thank you so much, Alexander. This has been great fun. And thank you very much for helping us better understand how we need to think about regulation as we embark or continue our Web3 and blockchain journey. And thank you all for joining us for this episode of W3B Talks. You can find out more information on this topic and many other topics at blockchainresearchinstitute.org. I'm your host, Doug Heinzman. We hope that you will join us for our next episode of W3B Talks.